Well, I hope you enjoyed the movie about composting toilets in Tuvalu. I want to turn to another country we talked about last week and look at adaptation there. Last week I explained about vulnerability and adaptation in Niue, and I want to talk about adaptation more today. So we talked a bit about vulnerability, and I discussed adaptation to two major climate risks in Niue, which were drought and cyclones. But actually, Niue faces a range of climate risks, and a range of adaptation options have been proposed and are progressively being implemented, and it's these I want to talk about today. Just to go back a little bit, countries are required to report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change on their implementation of their commitments under the convention. That includes reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions, but also on their activities with respect to adaptation. And Niue, like all small island states, has been a good citizen and done its national communications. And it's interesting to look at countries' national communications, and you can get them all on the Framework Convention on Climate Change website, and look at the evolution of thinking between first, second, and now up to third national communications from various countries, as well as looking at those from the major emitting countries and see what progress they've been making on reducing their emissions. So Niue's first national communication identified 28 adaptation actions, and this is going back now perhaps about 10 years. Progress on implementing these has been mixed. In some activities, progress has been very good, including sustainable agricultural practices such as mixed cropping. Niue has an organic farming organisation. It's the largest NGO in the country. And they're very effective, and people in Niue are interested in growing, and there's processes of organic farming and mulching and so on going on, which are proving to be quite effective. They have been very good at controlling clearing and illegal clearing and burning of the Tuvalu forest, which is one of the largest stands of native forest of its kind in the Pacific. And it's very important to the Niueans. It has symbolically great significance, and there are significant sites in there, including tapu sites. And controlling burning as a form of agricultural practice and logging in the forest has been very effective, and the forest is now well preserved, and that improves its resilience to climate change too. And some facilities which have been exposed to storm damage have been moved, in particular the bulk fuel depot. So these are things that are going well and that have been planned for over a decade and have been implemented. Other things are not going quite as well. There's been some modest progress on trying to grow forms of food and forms of agriculture that are less sensitive to climate change. As I said last week, it's difficult to irrigate in Niue because cultivation is shifting, soils are thin, and there's no surface water. But hydroponics is a very good idea, and that's for Niue, a very climatically suitable way of growing certain forms of food. And there is a major commercial hydroponic enterprise that grows cabbages and various vegetables, tomatoes. That's sold commercially, and it's a private sector activity, and it works quite well, and it demonstrates quite a lot of potential for this to be a good way and a climate adaptable way of providing fruit and vegetables in particular, to people in Niue. Protected areas, the forest is, large parts of the forest are protected areas, and establishing marine protected areas around certain reefs, building on traditional conservation practices. In all Pacific societies and coastal areas, there are traditional practices that establish no-take areas, no fishing, no harvesting areas at certain times of the year, or for certain periods of time over multiple years for various reasons. They might be linked to the death of an elder through to the observations of environmental change, or regular practices to ensure the sustainability of stocks. And Niue is built upon this history of traditional practices about conservation and expanded those to implement a few marine protected areas that are helping for coral to grow and to recover from cyclones, and improving the viability of fish stocks around the island. Policies for disaster preparedness have occurred slowly, perhaps not as quickly as you might think or one might expect since Cyclone Heta, but the police force, which is the main agency responsible for disaster management, has done some good work in warning systems and in stockpiling assets to help respond to an emergency. Some vulnerable infrastructure on the coast, which is vulnerable to cyclones, has been moved, in particular the hospital. And there's a new government building where a lot of the government services and government departments have now moved away from the coast and are in a more elevated and less coastal location, and this is reducing vulnerability to climate change. But there's more work that can be done on each of these issues. Some things are going quite slowly. Establishing an integrated coastal zone management plan is quite difficult, and this is difficult partly because of the size of the bureaucracies that are required to do this, even over a fairly small island. It's also difficult because of issues around who actually owns the coast, and there's ambiguity in the minds of most people about whether the government owns the shoreline or whether villages own the shoreline, and so on. That creates difficulties. Establishing monitoring systems and databases for all sorts of things: sea surface temperature, coral reefs, fisheries, soil moisture, etc. Health reporting, climate-related health reporting, is important to know what's going on and to begin to understand trends and patterns in order to be able to anticipate problems as they emerge. But doing so is quite technologically difficult. It requires sometimes a lot of support from people, and maintaining databases is expensive, and so that's something where progress hasn't been particularly rapid. There's a good meteorological service that collects good meteorological data. There was an agricultural farm that ran a lot of experiments that for periods of time had collected quite good data, but funding for a lot of that research has ended, though the meteorological service does have a good, and is probably the best, form of data collection and monitoring on the island. And finally, cultivating of drought-resistant crops that people could eat in times of drought that they currently don't grow, has not been particularly effective. People continue to grow the things that they like to eat, which are perhaps not as drought-resistant as other kinds of species they could grow. Here are some examples. This is a seedling farm in Niue, and this is vanilla beans, which is an industry that is struggling but has potential. The second national communication, which will be lodged with the convention hopefully this year in 2013, got more sophisticated about adaptation, identified more options, and these were also prioritised and ranked. They include all sorts of things, and things that don't necessarily obviously seem like climate change adaptation, yet when you think about them, do help to contribute to a more resilient society. They include things like using renewable energy more intensively to reduce the cost of diesel. Diesel imports in Niue are very expensive. They're a large share of imports. They're 5 or 6 times the total value of exports. So households pay a lot for electricity. The government pays a lot for electricity because diesel is the energy source that it's used. Not using diesel to produce electricity, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and using renewable forms of energy would free up a lot of money for households and for the government to spend on other things, as well as improve balance of payments. So it's a good idea. It creates opportunities for adaptation and for all sorts of other things. Disease monitoring system. Water quality monitoring is important. Niue's water reserves flow through the aquifer of the island. It's very complicated. Nobody really understands how it works. And so understanding that better and where contaminants get into the water system and how they move is important. Maintaining mosquito eradication programs to help reduce the spread of vector-borne diseases through mosquitoes. Increasing household gardening, for example. And I'm going to talk about a few of these in a bit more detail and explain some of the advantages to these and some of the potential disadvantages, just to give you, continuing to give you an idea about what adaptation really entails in a sort of detailed sense. So Niue grows a lot of taro. It's trying to develop vanilla, and once these products are harvested, they're either consumed locally. A little bit of taro is exported as the whole taro corm. Vanilla is typically exported mostly in the form of a dried vanilla bean. For growers and for the country as a whole, adding value to these is a very important form of climate change adaptation. It means that more money is delivered to the growers and to the country as a whole per unit of food grown on the land, which means not as much food has to be grown to generate income. Income that's generated from producing these things can be substituted for other forms of food if that's a desirable thing to do, or could be spent on other things. So adding value to agricultural production is a standard development policy, but it also contributes to adaptation. So it increases the value of resources, can overcome problems about exporting. exporting agricultural commodities in unprocessed forms from the Pacific Islands has always been very difficult. These are islands that are full of things like bananas and papaya, but getting them to major markets in Australia or New Zealand is very difficult because they perish, the supply chains break down. Processing them so they're in forms of dried papaya or taro chips or so on increases their transportability, decreases their perishability, and therefore makes for better exports into major markets. Makes sense. They're typically cheaper to transport because the volume is often less, and they can generate employment. So adding value is a good thing to do, but to do so does require some investment in equipment. You need machines to make taro chips, to slice them and dry them. Adding value to vanilla by making vanilla essence or vanilla paste requires some technology. And there is a history that these efforts in the Pacific to add value have failed, and so there is some reluctance to invest in enterprises where the market might not support them. But it's a good idea. Promoting household gardening and installing rainwater tanks on households is also a really good adaptation strategy. So Niue has plenty of water, but the problem is the cost of pumping it. That water can sometimes get contaminated, particularly after cyclones. And so having alternative water supply sources is quite a good idea. It reduces pumping costs if households can capture rainwater off their roofs and use it. That rainwater could also be used to irrigate plants around the house. So household gardening is a practice that Pacific Islanders have traditionally done. They've had a bush block where they grow, particularly in Polynesia, they grow most of their carbohydrates, taro in particular, and gardens around the house where they'll grow a lot of smaller, less intensive vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers and so on, as well as fruit trees, breadfruit, papaya and banana. But across the Pacific, partly because of urbanisation, partly because of food imports, partly because of increasing demands on labour, household gardening is a practice that people do much less now, and this is true in Niue too. Yet increasing household gardening irrigated through rainwater tanks could really help improve food security, diversify forms of supply. It is a form of food production that can be irrigated because it's fixed around the household. You can mulch small areas of soil and irrigate through rainwater tanks. It can improve nutrition. Micronutrient deficiency is a problem in Niue, and so growing more fruit and vegetables around the house is good for health. And it can reduce spending on food. Can improve water security through rainwater tanks, can reduce pumping costs, and can diversify water supply during times of drought or when the pumps fail, as can happen after cyclones. And it's a good practice. It's a cultural practice in a sense. It's getting people to do things differently, to spend a bit of time gardening around the house. And that's really the barrier. The cost of rainwater tanks is not particularly prohibitive for Niueans, and we're not talking about that many households, talking about maybe 500. And there's a little bit of maintenance around this. But really this is a habit issue, but it would be a really constructive thing to do to reduce vulnerability with respect to water and drought, and also with respect to food and nutrition. Growing things around gardens and celebrating that is something that Niueans do, particularly the older generation, if not the younger generation. Integrated coastal zone management is a good idea. There are all sorts of stresses on the reefs around Niue. They're prone to coral bleaching. They're prone to the accumulation of toxins, which is probably due to septic tanks leaking onto the reef. They're damaged due to cyclones. There's some risk of overfishing. Integrated coastal zone management really is an institutional process about coordinating practices between the land and the coast, so that there's a whole of system approach between the land and the sea, and all land-based activities are regulated and screened for their effect on the coast, as well as all marine-based activities and activities on the reef. It can really help improve the resilience of coral, reduce their likelihood to bleach during sea surface temperature events, and can help reduce the risk of fish poisoning. And these are risks that will increase in the future. It's quite difficult to do though. It requires multiple government agencies to cooperate. The Department of Agriculture and Fisheries and Forests needs to be involved, the Department of Economic Development, which makes decisions about foreign direct investment and new forms of development. The Environment Department, obviously. The Tourism Department, since it is involved in encouraging tourist facilities which are on the coast. Public Works Department, which maintains water supply systems and septic tanks and so on. Public Health Department. They need to be organised in a really systematic and regular and routinised way to make sure that coastal zone management is integrated, and it's very difficult to achieve that in any government, anywhere, including in Niue. So ICZM is often offered up as a great practice for sustainable development and for climate change adaptation, and it certainly is. But it's easier said than done. It requires quite a lot of organisation. Disease monitoring system is also important. Niue has had in the past, a dengue fever outbreaks, not for some time now, perhaps not for a couple of decades has there been a dengue outbreak, but it can happen. There is a lot of the vector, the mosquito that carries the disease often comes in through imports. And so things are moved across the wharf and they may contain the larvae or mosquitoes that carry this disease, and then it's spread through the island. So part of it's about maintaining quarantine vigilance. But it's also about keeping down the numbers of mosquitoes, so if it does come into the country, it doesn't spread because the mosquito population is low. Now, dengue fever and malaria are not things you want in a country, and they're things that a country like Niue doesn't generally have to contend with. But under climate change and changing rainfall and temperature regimes, it is more likely that these will become problems. And so monitoring for these incidents, for the incidence of these diseases is a very good idea. Can help understand the behaviour of these mosquitoes and these diseases if they begin to occur. And there's a range of other related diseases as well. Filariasis, which is borne by mosquitoes, diarrhoea, which is a water-related disease, fish poisoning, which is about toxins on the roof, and so on. So knowing what's going on with population health and monitoring changes in population health, people who are reporting to the doctors and reporting to the hospitals, keeping a record of what they're reporting about, the timing of those, the severity of those, the nature of the symptoms, the likely cause of those symptoms, and keeping a database of this over time is a really good preventative strategy to learn and help respond and anticipate to these problems. Good idea, but very difficult to do. There are only so many companies in the world that sell the computer databases that are required. They need to be installed, people need to be trained in using them, data needs to be continually entered and upgraded. And so for these reasons about cost, changing behaviours about the recording of data and skills, they tend not to work as well as they perhaps could. Renewable energy is another good idea. Has the potential to reduce diesel imports in Niue by up to 60%. Diesel powers electricity, as I said, through solar photovoltaic panels on major public buildings as well as households, the use of wind turbines to pump water more, to support the pumping of water, and through the use of solar hot water. And this is coming, a big solar hot water system upgrade across most households in Niue is underway. There's been an effort to replace light bulbs with more energy efficient LED globes and so on. So this can save households a lot of money. Electricity bills in Niue are very high, particularly relative to household incomes. That money could be spent on other things, buying better quality foods, buying rainwater tanks, buying plants to garden around the house. And it can save the government a lot of money and free up their disposable income to invest in other things around adaptation if they choose. But it's expensive, it's technologically expensive. A big wind turbine is a difficult thing to transport and implement and install in Niue. And knowing how to maintain these technologies is also something that requires training and labour, which is sometimes hard to achieve in Niue. So there's all sorts of things, and these are just some of the 44 proposals that Niue has put forward to adapt to climate change. There's various progress going on these, there are various barriers, but they're all fairly common sense, unsurprising things that in total add up to a more sustainable country, a country that's less vulnerable to climate change, and people that are less vulnerable to climate change, that make them less sensitive and give them more options for adapting to the changes that might come in the future. But it's not a single solution, it's not a big solution, it's a bunch of little things. A portfolio of activities, and this is the way adaptation looks when it's taken seriously and seriously considered in most places. Lots of things that are no regrets, that are going to give benefits irrespective of climate change, but that will also help reduce vulnerability to climate change.